Hey folks, your OS Reviews. You're watching our retro look back at the Fujitsu FinePix 2400Z. This stands for zoom, and this camera has a 3x optical zoom, which was relatively rare on a low-cost point-and-shoot when it was released in the year 2000. So this camera is over 17 years old. So you can see how far we've come in terms of making things slimmer and of course more functional. But again, this was one of the more low-cost point-and-shoot cameras back in the day with the color TFT LCD screen, and of course the convenience of being a digital camera of snapping as many images as you want and then editing them later on compared to film cameras. So taking a quick look at some of the hardware specifications of this thing, it came with a 2.1 megapixel CCD sensor, and it took 4 AA batteries, which is, a lot more than we see in modern point-and-shoot cameras. The camera is mainly made out of plastic, so you can see some areas where Fujitsu were able to cut a few corners just to make it a bit more lightweight and consumer-friendly in terms of its pricing. The top features a xenon flash. There is a viewfinder, a feature that you'll be hard-pressed to find on a modern camera, that also features a digital overlay. And what that means is if you look through this lens when the camera is on, you can see things like information about your shot, the resolution, the depth, the amount of zoom that you're using. So it's similar to the LCD screen in that sense. It has this graphical layout on top of what you're seeing in the real world. There's also access to a sliding door for the camera lens. It takes about 4 seconds on a cold boot to turn it completely on, and there's a bit of noise when it goes through its optical zoom, but it does function. And the top features an oversized camera shutter key, 2 stages, one to focus, one to capture your shot. And there's also an array of keys that you can select for taking an image or viewing back your shots. Now, this camera, another element that shows its age, is that it uses SmartMedia cards, which are cards that we no longer really find here in 2017. You can still find them used on Amazon or eBay perhaps, but again, this was the precursor to SD cards, and even now SD cards are going the way of micro SD, so things are just getting smaller and smaller all the time in terms of tech. On the back, you have access to that traditional LCD screen, very tiny by today's standards, but functional. The top also features an array of controls for toggling between display modes from the viewfinder to the screen. There's also flash mode, where you can turn the flash on, off, or into intelligent mode, back for the menu, as well as a up and down, left and right keys for going through the menu UI and for viewing back your images. On the back here, there's access to a standard tripod mount, and there's also the 4 standard AA batteries. Battery life isn't outstanding. It does drain relatively quick, especially if you have the flash turned on and you're constantly using the optical zoom, but at least it uses that and not a rechargeable pack. Otherwise, it probably won't hold a charge anymore here 20 years later. There's also a built-in 5-volt DC if you do have to use rechargeable AA packs, and there's also a USB port for connecting this into a computer. And there's also an optional accessory that allows you to connect it directly onto a television or a monitor, which are all pretty nice features. So taking a closer look at the user experience next, the device does have a 1.8-inch screen, so that's the screen size. Let's go and toggle this into the image taking mode. You can see that it has a detection for whether the lens cover is on or off. Let's flip this open, and you can see that the device will physically extend out its lens, and afterwards the digital zoom here is actually not done by extending it out even more. It's done by the lens on the inside moving closer to the optics of the glass. So we can zoom in, we kind of see that process happening if we look very closely, and then zoom out, so you can see how that optics are kind of integrated within the lens module, as opposed to more modern point-and-shoots where we have the physical lens extending or shrinking in to zoom. So that's kind of an interesting thing. By default, it's using the viewfinder as the digital overlay just to conserve on battery a little bit, and it works fine for day-to-day use, but I can tap on display once more to bring on the LCD, which you can see actually is okay. Not the greatest viewing angles, not very pixel dense or anything, but it's actually bright enough to be seen even in outdoor environments, and surprisingly, 20 years later, it can still be used for the most part. There's an LED light that tells you the status of focusing, if there's still memory remaining, and at 2 megapixels, the benefit, of course, is that your images aren't going to be super large. So for relatively small memory cards that you would pop into this thing, it can still take a decent amount of shots. Otherwise, it does do well even for macro shots and micro shots alike, since it does have that autofocus sensor, as opposed to fixed focus. And also, by cheap back in the day, it also wasn't super affordable. Now the MRSP price was around $500, but in a few months, around 2000, you could pick this up for about $300 or so, and it was cheap compared to other digital cameras and other digital point and shoots with a 2 megapixel resolution. Even then, there were already a few 5 megapixel sensors, 3 megapixel sensors creeping into the market, but those were more expensive, and Fujifilm was still relatively new to this game and trying to market their cameras at slightly less. And so by affordable, I also don't mean to the extent of, let's say, a $50 digital camera that you can pick up today at drugstores, maybe by Walgreens, by Vivitar or something like that. So it was still an investment, just considerably cheaper than other point and shoots. And part of that is, again, because of the brand and also because the technology was still new. So you still had to shell out a bit of money to get yourself a digital camera as opposed to something that used film, for instance. So taking a closer look at some of the things that you can do here. Zooming in, you can see that the display does a good job as far as showing you what is happening, even though, again, it is a little bit small. I can take a closer look at some of the details, tapping on the menu here. I can turn the macro mode on or off. There's also on or off for burst modes for the self-timer, and I can navigate these things by going left and right. So this allows me to navigate through these settings. And there's also the ability to toggle, flash directly. There's also a red eye reduction flash mode that I can use without having to go into the settings and dig for that, which I actually kind of like. Otherwise, that's essentially it. So very basic as far as software enhancements. You can't actually create panoramic shots. You're lacking many of the adjustments, contrast, saturation stuff that you get in newer cameras. And there also isn't video recording, so that's a feature that you'll find is lacking. One interesting thing about the sensor here is when it detects that it's in relative darkness, if you're kind of covering up with your hand, it thinks that the lens cover has somehow popped over it again, so it goes back into its shell automatically. And after a few minutes of inactivity, it also powers off just to conserve on battery for a little bit more. So no real complaints as far as the main functionality. This was really just a very simple and straightforward point-and-shoot camera. I would say the most surprising thing about the Fujifilm Finepix 2400Z is that it still works. Your shots are obviously not going to be crystal clear, but in moderate lighting, it still does an okay job, which seems surprising considering its 2 megapixel sensor. But then again, this is really a dedicated camera, and 2 megapixels here compared to maybe 2 or 3 megapixels on a smartphone, this is still obviously going to be better just because it has dedicated processing for the camera taking specifically, and the flash is a lot more powerful under low light environments compared to a LED flash on a phone. So there are still things going for it. Obviously, this is much more of a relic or a antique here in 2017, but nonetheless an interesting look back at a rather kind of early digital point and shoot that wanted to lower the threshold for people picking up a digital camera. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. This was a throwback retro look at the Finepix 2400Z zoom point and shoot digital camera.